Hey, Kua.
Hey, Kendra.
I'm so excited for this podcast episode.
You know what? We are back with another episode of the Black Gems Dive In podcast, and we are at the Congressional Black
Yes,
Caucus.
here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, so we're really excited. This is the annual legislative conference, and this is the 53rd year that this has been happening. And so we're really excited to come to you all and talk a lot about what we always talk about, right?
Yes.
And so we have a guest today, and we are so excited to bring Miles Gresham, who is the policy director at Neighbor to Neighbor, Massachusetts. So Miles, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hey, Miles.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
And it's Buffalo connections because
Right.
we're out here, chatting with folks, networking, and we're always going to see somebody from Buffalo.
Always from Buffalo. I mean, one thing about Buffalo is that we show up, we show out,
Right.
and we care about deep-seated issues.
Absolutely.
And being here in DC and convening here, especially nation's capital, but also going to Capitol Hill yesterday,
Yeah.
talking to some folks, just really great and positive energy, especially going into this election season.
Absolutely, right? And so it was a random incident, yesterday. And so we were going to this unbought and unbossed session.
Yep.
Right. And this was a session that was started by
Shirley
Shirley
Chisholm.
Chisholm. And I forgot the name of the organization, but
It's Black women for or congressional women.
yeah,
or something like
Congressional
that, yeah,
Black
Black
women. It's a committee of some sort, but it was Shirley Chisholm, Dorothy Heights,
Yes.
and who else? Was
Angela
it?
Davis was
Coretta
a part
Scott
of
King
Coretta
was a
Scott
part
King,
of that
yes.
as well, and so it was really powerful. But in the elevator, we actually rode the elevator with Andrew Young, right?
Yes.
And so, living civil rights legend.
Yes.
We were just chatting. I was like,
You look familiar.
it's very familiar, right? And so they were very kind and gave us some really great words of encouragement.
Yeah.
And so,
Just
yeah,
to
this
keep
is what
going.
this is
So
about,
awesome.
right?
Mhm. Yeah. So we normally, we're going to follow our regular format. But
Yeah.
before we begin, Miles, can you just introduce yourself to our listeners? What do you do? And the importance of this conference?
Of course. Can I ask us a brief question?
Yes.
This is my first podcast. I'm very excited.
Oh.
Am I supposed to be doing this, like looking at you, like we're having a
Yeah,
conversation?
yes.
Or do I look at that?
Yeah,
Okay. Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry. Apologies. to the
This is
production.
live. This is what happens
All
live.
So, hello. My name is Miles Gresham. I'm the policy director for Neighbor to Neighbor Massachusetts. Neighbor to Neighbor Massachusetts is a two-part organization. We have a 501c3, which focuses on issue-based campaigning and power building,
Mhm.
and then a 501c4, which focuses on running independent electoral campaigns for candidates in Massachusetts
Nice.
to advance
Yeah.
our goals. And so we are a power building organization. We have chapters in 4 states made up of the Black and Latino people who are becoming the majority in a lot of what we call gateway cities in Massachusetts. So Springfield, Holyoke, Worcester, and Lynn. We also have a presence in Boston. And we are a member-based organization. We decide our priorities through our members and through the things that are impacting them directly, and then we get after it on the C3 and C4 side. We work on housing justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and anything else that affects our people. Like Audre Lorde said, we're not a single issue organization,
Right.
to
Yeah.
paraphrase, because we don't live single issue lives.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
But that's in a nutshell what Neighbor to Neighbor does.
That's
Love it.
awesome. And as we move to a plurality, we know that we're not going
Right.
to have a single ethnic or racial majority in this
Right.
country, right? And so
Sure.
you talking about the shifts that are happening. Same thing in Buffalo. We know that new Americans are really driving the growth in population in Buffalo, and I can see that happen in large cities and small cities
Yeah.
across the country. So
Yeah, absolutely. So we appreciate the work that you do,
Yeah,
for sure.
I appreciate you too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Honored to be here.
So as always, we always start with our topic. So we're going to go into our diversity dispatch.
Yeah.
And this is where, for our new listeners, where we highlight something that is pressing, something that's come up in the news recently, and something that we just want to put on alert for our listeners of what's
Right.
going on. So we have Kua, who's going to introduce our diversity dispatch.
y'all. So we've talked about this specific topic, near and far in between, right? And so this is actually coming from the Washington Post. And it says that the Fearless Fund settles with DEI foes and it ends the grant program for Black women. And so it says that the Fearless Fund, a venture capital firm, will shutter its grant program for Black women as part of a settlement with affirmative action opponents, resolving one of the most high-profile cases in the legal battle over diversity, equity, and inclusion. In a filing submitted Wednesday in federal court in Atlanta, an attorney for the conservative activist Edward Bloom wrote that the parties had settled and asked the court to dismiss the case. This is the guy who also helped lead the court challenge for Harvard University, right?
Affirmative action.
For affirmative action at the education level. And so it talks about race exclusive programs like the one the Fearless fund promoted are divisive and illegal, Blum said. He said that opening grant programs to all applicants, regardless of their race, is enshrined in our nation's civil rights laws and supported by significant majorities of all Americans. We know that that's not the case, right? We've talked about things like legacy admissions in universities and how they're not attacking programs like that. But in this case, it's really unfortunate because we know that venture capital for Black women is less than 1%.
Yes.
And so when that's the case, you have to have programs like this that really look to bring us up in our organizations and the businesses that we're starting, but unfortunately, that's just not the case. And so at this point in time, the Fearless Fund, they said that it was actually at the end of that grant program anyway, but because they didn't want this to be a precedent that was set across the country, that ended up settling, right? Because if they didn't, and then they struck it down at that level, it really would have deterred all those types of efforts. And so what are y'all thoughts on that? You know, hearing that, feeling that? It's a lot to take in, you know? So what do you think?
So for me personally, I know we had talked about this months ago when we first started hearing about this ruling and the implications behind it. And something that I even saw that the Fearless Fund shared yesterday on their social media. There's a few things that they wanted to point out, which I think is really imperative to the narrative of the story. So one thing they said too is that, number one, elections have consequences.
Absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
And they really wanted to highlight that. One thing they talked about is that we have 3 federal rulings in this process where 4 Trump appointed judges ruled against them, 2 Clinton and 1 Obama appointed judges ruled for them. And the writing is on the wall for who wants this work to continue and who does not. And one thing they said is be sure to vote on November 5th. And one thing that we always say in this podcast is that we don't tell you who to vote for. So I just always want to put that out there. But we know that elections do have consequences. And this work is really important. It's imperative that this work continues. And so they said this is why they have invested millions of dollars and awarded grants for over 500 people. And so we just have to continue to be creative of how we're going to fund programs such as women-owned businesses, minority-led businesses as well, because we know, and something we're going to talk about on the pod later on is, again, we know DEI is under attack and the implications behind that. And so, one thing that people said initially is that, is this a win? Is this a victory? That's left to be unsaid, I guess, or people, decide whether it's a win or not, but we have to continue to push this forward.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of questions that came up. One of the things that they wrote on their social media too was that any false narrative floating that anyone is claiming that we are not moving forward at the Fearless Fund is not true.
Correct.
What is true is that we're proud to announce our new debt fund, and that's a loan program. It's live on their website for under-resourced entrepreneurs, male and female. And so one of the things that I also want to point out is that this isn't just happening, on a micro level. There's a lot of foundations across the country that are now looking at changing some of their language, right? Because they specifically spell out things like racial equity, racial justice, specific funds that are for Black and brown communities. And now they're trying to soften some of that language and come up with other terms, right? To still do the same thing, I think, but ultimately not be under attack at that Supreme Court level. So under-resourced, underfunded, underrepresented. I'm sure there's going to be a lot different language that's being used moving forward, but these are things that we'll have to kind of keep our eye out. And on one level, I know we kind of chatted earlier about maybe that's not a bad thing to kind of, get from under the eye of all this attention under the attack of DEI.
Yeah, I think because of the history of the country, like we'll always be under someone's eye. Unfortunately, that's always going to happen, right? But I think that, like you said, there are ways to modify language to make it legally acceptable, and we're not offering legal advice either, by the way. But modifying it to make it like legally acceptable, and so people are looking at doing that. But I also just want to say, there's also a lot of fear, right, from companies, from foundations, and that fear, that sort of attack on DEI that is, represented by what these Trump-appointed judges are doing, that's represented by what the aims of Project 2025 are, right? That kind of pushback against DEI is causing we don't want it to cause like a snowball effect. And so I think that's kind of the fear, right? And like, it's important, I think, to point out, and I don't want to go too much into it now, but like DEI and affirmative action are 2 very different things. And affirmative action when the Supreme Court made its ruling right last year with the SFFA case, they didn't actually touch Title VII. They didn't actually touch the effect of affirmative action on employment. This was about schools, and it was about race-based quotas, right? And so there's language even in that decision that says you can still consider race, right? Most DEI programs are not affirmative action programs, right? And so this idea that you have to back away from racial equity altogether is more fear than actually substantiated by the law right now.
And one thing, and to your point too, one thing that we've been seeing is that many colleges and universities as well, you're seeing the enrollment dip when it comes to diversity in their numbers for their freshmen and sophomores and so forth. You're seeing those numbers dip, right? And I think again, it's that fear, right? So even when affirmative action came to play with the ruling last year, so many colleges spoke up and said, we're still going to do this work, but we're also looking at the data right now and saying, there's some shifts that's happening, right? So. And I think to your point, is based in fear and those implications as well.
Right. Yeah. You know, lots to consider, lots to think about, and we'll continue to follow this, right, moving forward. But like they said, elections have consequences. And so we're at this point, and I think it was a couple podcasts ago where we talked about the current vice president nominee for the Republicans, J.D. Vance, and he put a bill forward in Ohio as a senator to ban DEI at the federal level. And so we're not surprised because it's actually a nod to our deep dive, which we're going to get into in just a few. But essentially, that's what they're going to do under the implications of Project 2025 as well. And they all have connections to them and the Heritage Foundation. But we'll get into that in just
it's a playbook.
It is.
It's a playbook, you know, and this is a page turner next, you know. So before we go into our deep dive, one more segment that we always talk about is our hot topic. And so for our hot topic, we dive into something that everyone is talking about, something that's at the forefront and is also pressing issues. And so for this hot topic on this week, we're going to talk about the presidential debate. So I know we all watched a lively debate. There's a lot of commentary behind the debate. It's funny because like we always talk about, we never tell you who to vote for. And so when we try to bring articles to you guys, we try to get a non-biased view of the articles, but it's very hard. It's tough to do. Very tough and very hard to find a non-biased view for the presidential debate. So this past week, we all watched the debate. And there's an article by NBC News that talks about 6 takeaways from the first Harris-Trump presidential debate. And we'll talk about some of those takeaways, but the article goes on to say Kamala Harris and Donald Trump clashed in their first presidential debate Tuesday in Philadelphia, less than 2 months before Election Day. Heading into the debate, Harris appeared to have more to gain and more to lose. So a New York Times Siena College poll found that 28% said that they needed to learn more about Kamala Harris, compared with just 9% who said the same thing about Trump. Overall, Trump led Harris by 1 point among likely voters, with 5% unsure or not backing either. And so the debate covered a wide range of issues and features a series of intense exchanges between the two rivals. Harris presented herself as pragmatic problem solver and diminished Trump as a wannabe dictator and can't keep his rally crowds engaged. Trump attacked Harris as a radical and frequently returned to his theme of criticizing migration, sometimes veering into conspiracy theories. And so it goes on to talk about some of the takeaways. And before we dive into that, I guess, what are some of the takeaways that you guys have for the debate? I mean, for me, I know it's like we don't want to go deep into it about some of those takeaways, but we know that one thing that a lot of people, no matter what side of the coin you were on, so many people wanted to hear about policies. Right. And so we know that people are constantly looking to the website. People are constantly talking about what are the policies, what are some of the issues that are at the forefront of this country. We know obviously DEI is under attack. They talked about Project 2025, which we'll get into as well. But some of the policies that we wanted to see more about was in terms of immigration, things that are happening at the border, healthcare. These are things that economics, environmental justice, right? These are things that climate change that are pressing issues. And for me personally, unfortunately, those issues weren't at the forefront because we had to kind of peel back the layers, right? And I was looking forward to another presidential debate. I know yesterday,
I don't think that's going to happen.
It's not going to happen. I was going to say yesterday they talked about how Trump does not want to have another debate, but I do think that it's important to put out the actual plan and policies for the American people.
Yeah, I agree with you. I tend to agree with you that it was difficult to get there. I'm not gonna lie, I was very entertained. You
Yes.
know, I'll just put that at the forefront. What they say is that these debates, I don't know if we can see that they really shift that
Yeah.
much, right, in terms of people's thoughts around the election itself. And so we'll see what that looks like afterwards. But what I did find interesting was that after the debate, Trump went to the spin gallery to talk to the press directly. And so a lot of folks had a lot to say about that, right? Like, did that mean that he thought that he didn't do well, so he wanted to go and give more information and really attack his opponent, or vice versa? And so I don't know what your thoughts were. What are you thinking? There's a lot to say, I'm sure.
Yeah. It was interesting.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. You talked about enrollment at colleges dropping, right? And I think Kamala is a great reminder that HBCUs are always an option.
That's true.
So that's my first thought.
Yeah.
My second thought is that she was the top prosecutor in one of the biggest states in the country.
Absolutely.
I wasn't surprised that this went this way. Right. One of the things that Trump has always done is kind of steamrolled his opponents in debate just by bluster and by name calling, and that's very something true. That prosecutors are kind of used to dealing with.
Yeah.
When they prosecute people.
That's
so I think she wasn't. I think she was the least flustered of anyone I've seen
to debate
go up against Trump, and I think that came across clearly to most viewers. It seemed.
Right.
I can't read the tea leaves any better than you all or Nate Silver or anybody else, right? And we never know what happens until the election.
Right. I don't trust polls really.
Right. No,
after the last election, to be honest.
Right. But it seemed like she. She more than held her own. I think that she baited him often and successfully, and that was good to see. I do think that both sides were light on policy because there was so much else that she had to kind of
navigate,
get through, accusations about her blackness to like every other ridiculous to the plight of cats and dogs in Ohio. There were all kinds of things that kind of like distracted people from policy conversations. But I think it was interesting. I do think that people deserve another debate. But
I agree.
I think Trump saw what happened in the first one, and does I think someone in his team, he did get elected president. Like you know what I mean? They're not. I hate to say this, they're not like totally incompetent, right? And they saw what happened, and you're trying to protect their guy. You know what I mean? So we'll get another debate. Yeah.
I think also too, to your point where you said, he was elected before, right? And it's interesting because I remember one instant they were talking about healthcare and Obamacare, and they said, "What is the plan?" And that was an actual question, like, what is the plan for healthcare moving forward? And he said, have concepts of a plan. Yeah. So again, we see that things are not fully baked out. And also too, to your point about having another election or even having to pull back in, Kamala almost having to defend herself in so many different ways. A couple of things too. She has said, "I'm not Biden." And I remember she said that too. She said, "I'm not Biden." And I think, at one point in time, Trump had talked about how, she's basically an extension of him, and currently, yes, as the vice president, but moving forward, she's like, "I'm Kamala Harris, put some respect in my name,
little sprinkle, right?
Put some respect in my name." And so I don't think, to your point, I don't think he was ready for that. I think he was just thinking it's going to be an extension of what Biden is already doing. And so she made it known, and she came prepared.
I thought so too.
So we have less than 55 days, around 54,
probably 50, around 50 days,
to 50 days,
something like that. I know.
Who's counting?
I am, but we know when it comes to the election and the day of the election, it's still going to be a lot of
for sure
fallout, no matter what happens. So so we'll see.
We will, y'all. We will. Yeah. We just gotta. It's the endurance to get through it. 50 days feels like, I don't know. Some days it feels like, oh my gosh, that's not a lot of time. Other days it's like, man, I can't wait until it gets here. Right?
Yeah. So, but being in spaces like this gives me,
for sure,
energy to keep moving forward. Because we're in this together. So it just gives me a lot of energy and hope. So the work still needs to be done.
For sure.
At the end of the day, the work still needs to be done.
And we've met so many people who are doing the work, right? And talking about what they're doing on their local level, which I think is really important as well. I think just being able to be near that and close to that is very inspiring. And it also makes me think about, remember when we met Stacey Abrams, where she talked about sometimes like the pomp and circumstance around people, like we put them on a pedestal, but the reality is we all have the ability to impact and affect change, right? And so this is what this reminds me of, seeing folks on the ground doing the work. We can do the work too, y'all. We have to do the
and
work,
we're human. She added that human element. She said, I remember going to my grandma's house and putting my head on her lap crying.
Right.
We're human, so we just have to keep uplifting each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna get into our deep dive, y'all, and then we know our deep dive is when we really hone in on a specific topic. Today we're gonna be talking about the implications of Project 2025. And so I'm sure y'all have heard about Project 2025. It came up in the debate again, obviously. This is something that conservatives have really put an effort together. It's a playbook. It's 900 pages.
A playbook.
And it talks about a variety of different policy and things that they want to change and shift. And this is for the first 100 days, if their candidate goes forward, which is Trump at this point in time, right? And so we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into this conversation. The article that I'm going to read from is from Fast Company, and it says that this is exactly how Project 2025 plans to gut DEI. And so just an update, we know that Paul Dans was the executive director over Project 2025. And earlier this month, he announced that he was stepping away from the Heritage Foundation. That was because all the hoorah around this plan and folks really saying, y'all need to hone into this, get an understanding of what they're trying to do. And so at the conservative think tank, that's the Heritage Foundation, he had been tasked with directing Project 2025, a multi-pronged initiative to support the next Republican president. The idea was to build a database of conservative players who could serve in the future administration as like a conservative LinkedIn is what they were calling it, and compile a sweeping set of policy and proposals. And so one of the things that we know when you think about Project 2025 is the connection to dismantling DEI programs at the federal level. There's a lot of things that they're really looking at that relates to that. A lot of this is deleting terms like sexual orientation and gender identity, which is SOGI data, and we know that we rely on that. coming from healthcare, it's so important that we have an understanding of who we're serving and being able to disaggregate that so we know where to put resources, how to impact change on that level. They're also looking to dismantle terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term that they describe to be used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. And so it's a blueprint. It literally is looking at things like they're calling a woke agenda. So critical race theory, and at this point in time at the Department of Education, they're looking to dismantle this. So across the board, we know that this is a concerted attack on a lot of things that we stand for and the initiatives that we do. We know that this isn't new. President Trump, under his administration, dismantled it at the federal level as well. And then when Biden won, he put it back together. And so what else y'all got to say about that and just thoughts? And
I have so many thoughts. I remember when I first started hearing about Project 2025, and it was something that so many people were like, I hear rumblings, I don't know exactly what it is. I know it's just a large document, right? But this is something that has been in the forefront for years.
Absolutely.
Years. And it's just a remixed version. And I remember, and I'll have to look it up, but I remember even this past year when I was at the National Urban League Conference, I had sent you a message about, it was basically Project 25 was something that was put into this playbook back in the civil rights movement.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so this was something that was already done.
Yes.
And now it's just amplified. And so the scary thing about it is that it is a playbook. It's something that a lot of people are giving cliff notes, but I really do think that we should be reading this thing, really looking at it, dissecting it.
Absolutely.
Because at the end of the day, it's really deepening those culture wars that we see day in and day out. To your point, right, we're talking about data, some of the things that we measure when it comes to funding, when it comes to just educating our kids, and all of that is being eradicated. And so it is scary. It is really scary. And this is why when we're talking about local elections, we're talking about policy, the grassroots organization. So things that you're doing, Miles, we really appreciate what you're doing, because this is where some of those things are going to start to change and take a turn. But we know local elections matter, all these different things. And so it's not like, hey, let's just concentrate on Project 25. We have to really dissect it and see what can we start to do at our local level to really start to influence and change. Because guess what? It's not going away.
It's not.
So if Kamala gets elected, we still have to continue to fight.
Right.
It's almost like the effect of, I think about, and I'm going on this tangent, but I think about, after Barack Obama, was elected president, it felt like some people just sat back and said, we're done.
We're done. We got this in there. We could sit back.
But that was just
racism.
Right. He ended racism over.
It's a post-racial society.
But this was only the beginning.
Absolutely.
And which is kind of like scary to think about, right? It was only 2008 was only the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. So that was just something that I think about, right? We have to keep dismantling this because it's not going away after election season.
I just want to highlight too, you mentioned that this was a playbook that had happened before. I actually bought that book, and it was around like the Southern Manifesto.
Yes.
That really looked to dismantle a lot of the policy that was put in place in order to uplift people of color, disenfranchised folks, underrepresented groups. And so since the beginning of this country, we know that, people of color, people that are gay, folks with disabilities, everyone has had a struggle in this country. And it kind of sets this tone against what they consider a true American versus what they don't, right? And how they want to implement that moving forward. So what are your thoughts? I know you do policy work. So from that standpoint, just, give us your thoughts on Project 2025 and what that means at this point.
Yeah, I think you two said a lot of important things, and there are a lot of important things that you said that kind of thread into what this is about. Yeah. So you were talking about how, this caucus that we're at is this conference is an example of people from all over the country doing the work, right? On all levels, local, state, federal, right? And that's what Project 2025 is the culmination of. Like you both said, this is something that has roots in the Southern strategy that was developed right after the civil rights movement didn't really end in 1968.
Right.
But in 1968, when Nixon, is running, that's when this comes into play. And there's an interview by one of the architects of that strategy, Lee Atwater. It was an interview that he gave in the 80s. And I don't know if I can quote from it because there's a bit of explicit language. I don't know how family friendly this podcast is.
A little bleep.
But you go to bleep bleep.
But he says, we can't say after 1968, we can't say N-word, right? So we have to get more abstract and talk about forced busing and talk about about states' rights, and talk about cutting taxes and cutting programs. And he said the effect of that is that Black people get hurt way more, right? When there are cuts to the federal government, right? Black people are employed by the federal government, right? That impacts our ability to buy homes and our economic wealth, right? Right? Like when the Voting Rights Act is gutted by a Supreme Court, right? That affects our ability to get to the polls, right? And of course, we saw in 2020 who was it, like the last line of defense, right, for our republic. It wasn't, a typical battlefield. It was people. It was poll workers, right? In Georgia and in Pennsylvania and Arizona, right? Those were the people at that local level, level that often gets overlooked.
Right.
And what this is Project 2025 is a culmination of, since the late 60s, Republicans have been doing exactly what we're saying we need to do now,
exactly,
right? Which is they've been taking over school boards, taking over zoning boards, taking over, devolving power from cities to county governments, which we don't know anything about that. Where we come from, right? But that's what it's been about. And so now this is, like you said, like a page. This is the next page, right? This is something that they've been working on, and so the fight back has to happen at all levels too, right? Every the local elections, Democrats are a lot harder to get to the vote than Republicans.
That's
right.
very true.
If you can, and we've seen it in Massachusetts, though, if you can mobilize, even 10% of the voting of the electorate to show up, right, you can change so many of these seats, and so many of these folks are in power. And so that's what that's what conservatives have been working on quietly, right? For over 50 years now. And now Project 2025 is coming out, and people are like, where did this come from? This sort of Bond villain like plan. No, they've been telling us this. They've been telling us this for over 50 years.
Absolutely.
And now here it is. And so we know what we need to do to fight back, because we know how it came into place. And like you said, we can do the work too.
Absolutely.
So we have to do the work.
Yeah, I think it needs to be a concerted effort, to your point, right? You were saying conservatives have been doing this quietly over years.
Right.
And, when we talk about the Southern Manifesto, which is Project 2025 prior to what it is now, that really came about after the response to Brown versus Board of Education,
Mhm.
right? And so now what is the response of the Democrats? When you're looking at Project 2025, we're looking at all these different things. It has to be a concerted effort, right? To your point and what we're talking about. And so we talked about this in our podcast a few weeks ago. At least I said it in my podcast. I'm like, it doesn't matter who owns it. Right. It doesn't matter who owns it. I don't care if it's the Urban League. I don't care if it's NAACP. I don't care if it's grassroots organizations. But we need to all come together and put together a playbook.
Right.
That benefits everyone.
Yeah.
Right. We talked about a couple podcasts ago, targeted universalism. Right. How is this benefiting everyone?
The
because
the
curb cut effect.
Absolutely.
Because if you're looking at just Project 2025 and you're just looking at whatever the response is, it's like, we need to come at a point where we're looking at that target universalism, seeing how is this going to benefit everyone? Because at the end of the day, we're going to continue to be at this war.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, again, this has been happening for years, but we really need to come up with a response.
Yeah, we do. And I think, like being here, there's a lot of conversations around policy work and the importance behind that. And these grassroots organizations, we just saw one yesterday that was at the Unbought and Unbossed conversation.
Super
majority, right? They're doing the work on the ground and they're doing phone banking and getting folks, I think they said they made 8,500 calls and had 100 people commit to voting.
Yes.
So that's 8,500 calls to get 100 people to say, yes,
Yeah.
I'm absolutely
vote.
voting, which shows you, to your point, the difficulty in mobilizing.
Right.
So, we need to amplify that times a million to get folks really excited and thinking about how this stuff is going to impact them. And I think that's the other piece, is that oftentimes we're like, oh, this doesn't impact me, or, you don't fully understand it. And we often talk about how even when we think about things like DEI, we have to take it from this abstract view and bring it down to, level conversation so that folks can say, oh, this is what you mean? We put this in place so that, you might be pregnant, but you're gonna have a job when you come back from, leave.
Right.
You might have a disability, but we're gonna make sure that we accommodate you reasonably within an organization. And so all these things where people were like, oh, of course I believe in that.
Right.
You don't see the connection to that point, at this point in time. So I think we have to spend a lot of times really breaking this conversation down, talking about these terms in a way that people understand how it impacts them on a day-to-day basis and why they should really get out there and vote.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you said about 8,500 calls to have 100
Yes.
people, but that's what we call organizer math.
Right.
And I was thinking like, that's actually not that bad. That's less than 10.
Oh, really?
That's more than 10% of the people they called actually.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not that horrible. Well, 1%, right? Still, it's not that bad.
Right.
What you said, all that you said is absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It takes more time to say all that than it does to say that like people are eating cats and dogs in Ohio.
Yeah. Exactly.
And one of them, I'm a card-carrying member of the Democratic Party and proud of it.
Yeah.
Our party is not as good with narrative.
Agreed.
Right.
Storytelling.
And storytelling.
Absolutely.
Right. And they have to get better at that if they want people to understand. Because right now, there's lots of people saying there's not that much difference between Democrats and Republicans.
Very true.
And when you look at certain things and certain outcomes, if you look at cities and say, okay, well, this person in charge is a Democrat and there are problems that aren't being addressed, right? And the Republicans don't care either, and it's very simple for them to make that argument, right?
That point, yeah.
Right.
Until bodily autonomy is gutted, right? Because of the people who, the folks who got elected, who appointed people to the Supreme Court, or until your voting rights are gutted, right? Until and so this is, something that we need to do a better job of communicating to folks. And also, if people are going to build a plan together, they have to talk to each other. They have to be, we also the Republicans to their benefit and their detriment embraced the populist side of their party, right? From the Tea Party first and then Trump, right? If Democrats are kind of, when it's time for us to all fight together, we're all together, right? But when it's time for us to sit down and make policy, that's a whole different game, right? And so we have to change the way we plan together and the way we communicate those plans to our people if we're gonna, have a fighting chance and not have to be always on the cusp of having to push back fascism. Almost 100 years after World War II. You know what I mean?
Facts. So we always say we are not at the Beverly Gray where we normally film, and so we are on a time restraint. So we have about less than 5 minutes left. And so with that being said, I guess what are the next steps for you guys? Like, where do we go from here? How are we giving the people hope? How are we giving them an action plan to move forward and really dismantle some of these systems that have been in place for years. I know we can't give a full synopsis in less than 5 minutes, but where do we go from here? Just giving someone a glimpse of hope.
Yeah, I think, we talk about it from an organizational level as it relates to this work. And the last podcast, we actually talked about Robbie Starbuck, who is a right-wing conservative activist who was actively going to organizations and blowing a lot of noise around their DEI efforts. Right. And these large organizations, a week after, are dismantling these programs at the organizational level. And so I think, we have to think about how we do this work. We've talked about this, weaving it throughout operations, making sure that we look at where it's situated in organizations and do more than some of this performative stuff that these organizations have done. Yep. It's great to celebrate Heritage Months, but that can't be all that you're doing. We have to think about equity decision making. We have to think about collaborative decision making, bringing people to the table and amplifying their voices. And so from an organizational standpoint, I think fortifying it through operations is the way to go for next steps as it relates to that. Miles, what do you think in terms of just general policy work and what we need to be thinking about?
I think in terms of DEI, again, it's important to really be clear on what DEI is and what it is not. Yep. Affirmative action is a set temporary policy with really specific racial goals, right? That's not what DEI is. Right. DEI is about diversity of backgrounds, experiences, right? Yeah. And again, going back to that Supreme Court case, Justice Roberts said in the majority opinion, it is not illegal to consider how race has impacted someone, right? In considering diversity efforts, right? So it's not, race is not off the table, and being really clear about that in order to push back against the fear, I think is one thing. I think being really clear that, DEI is still legal. One of the things that Democratic attorney generals did is they communicated to businesses after this that, this does not mean that the DEI efforts are illegal, right? And then the other thing is just, what they say about getting off social media and touching grass, right? Like people are doing this work, right? Like all over the place. Like they are doing it without, pomp and circumstance, right? And they are flipping seats, right? They are changing policies, right? There's a person in Massachusetts, I won't plug any of our people, but there's someone in Massachusetts who was he was the first Puerto Rican state senator, right? In Massachusetts, in a city, coming from a city that's like heavily Puerto Rican, right? That person was able to pass laws like banning discrimination in schools and the workplace. They were able to get billions of dollars for public housing and for housing development, right? To address our housing crisis, right? So these policy fights, they seem big and scary and complex. They are so winnable, right? And we're talking about 10% of the vote. Every one of these fights is winnable. We can do this.
We can absolutely,
and we are doing it. So.
Yes.
Yeah, remembering that is important.
I love it. So we always wrap up with our gem of the day. And so, Miles, I know you're new to the table, but we always try to give and leave our people with something just of inspiration. And so, I'll start first for the sake of time. One thing that I've been thinking about is yesterday someone said this at one of the sessions we were in, is that we have a moral obligation not to sit on our blessing. And everyone has a blessing, everyone has a purpose, everyone has a lane, whether it is phone baking, whether it is helping with policy making, whether it's grassroots organizing. We all have a blessing and we should not be sitting on it because our future depends on it. So
I'm just gonna say my gem of the day is to embrace your own power, right, and influence, and recognize that you have the ability to impact and affect change. At the end of the day, I think that we look at, even conferences like this where we see folks who are Congress people and they're doing all this work from a policy level. We have to get together at the local level in order to push that change forward. So get involved, come out there. Like Miles said, this is winnable, right? And so let's really take in our own power and our authority to impact change.
Absolutely.
Forward,
Yeah.
What's your gem of the day?
I don't have any wise gems like that. I wasn't prepared for, but I always think about events like this, and I think about if people in power had their way, where we would be, right? Most of us in this room would be enslaved.
Yeah,
right?
Very true.
We're here because these fights are winnable.
Right.
right? We're proof of that.
Yes.
And this is our turn to prove that.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah,
kind of an
I love
honor,
that.
right? When you
Yeah.
think about all that we've come through and the shoulders of the people that we stand on
Yeah.
and where we're sitting right
Absolutely.
now
Yes.
from this place, we get to do this stuff.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
And like Malcolm X said, our history did not begin in chains and it will not end in chains. And that's what keeps me going. So yeah, that's my
Awesome.
gem.
Awesome. All right. So before we head out, just make sure that you follow us.
Yes.
Share, we are on YouTube, Black Gems Dive In Podcast. We're also on social media, Facebook,
The Black Gems.
Yes.
Podcast. Yep.
We are also on Instagram, and now we are on LinkedIn, and so we're going to amplify that platform as well.
Absolutely.
So please make sure that you have conversations with us. Like I said, like, share, and subscribe.
Yeah, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Black Gems Dive In Podcast.
Absolutely.
See y'all next time.
Bye.
Peace.